By the third morning, the men had stopped asking when resupply would arrive. They had learned to count rounds instead. In the spring of 1968, a reinforced rifle company from the 25th Infantry Division was operating in the jungle west of Cu Chi, near the Cambodian border. The mission had been described as a standard reconnaissance patrol. Intelligence indicated scattered enemy activity in the area, nothing concentrated enough to warrant concern. The company numbered just under 130 men, organized into 3 rifle platoons and a weapons platoon. They carried the standard combat load for infantry operations in Vietnam: 14 magazines per rifleman, belts of ammunition for the M60 machine guns, and fragmentation grenades distributed according to tactical necessity. It was considered adequate for a patrol expected to last 4 days. The terrain was triple canopy jungle. Visibility rarely extended beyond 30 meters in any direction. Movement was slow and methodical. The point squad advanced carefully, watching for tripwires and disturbed earth. Behind them, the main body moved in staggered column, maintaining intervals that allowed for communication but reduced vulnerability to ambush. The heat was oppressive. Humidity hung in the air like a physical weight. Soldiers drank water constantly, refilling canteens from streams that had to be treated with iodine tablets. The jungle absorbed sound in strange ways. A man could be 10 meters away and invisible beneath the vegetation. The company had been inserted by helicopter 3 days earlier at a landing zone cleared by engineers 2 months before. The LZ was already beginning to disappear under new growth. Within an hour of insertion, the company had moved into the jungle and established a patrol base. From there, they began methodical sweeps of the assigned sector, moving in deliberate arcs that allowed them to cover ground while maintaining security. Contact was expected. Intelligence reported that North Vietnamese Army units used this area as a staging zone for operations closer to Saigon. The jungle provided concealment and access to supply routes that ran south from Cambodia. American units had been working this area for months, trying to disrupt those routes and locate base camps. On the second day, the lead platoon found evidence of recent enemy activity. A trail showed signs of use within the previous 48 hours. Boot prints were visible in the mud near a stream crossing. The company commander, a captain with 2 previous tours in Vietnam, halted the advance and called in the discovery. He requested permission to follow the trail and was granted authorization to pursue. The pursuit was cautious. The captain understood that trails in this jungle were often watched or booby-trapped. The point squad moved slowly, checking the ground and the vegetation overhead. Behind them, the rest of the company followed at intervals that allowed mutual support but prevented bunching. The trail led deeper into the jungle, away from the original patrol route. By late afternoon on the second day, the company was 6 kilometers from the nearest artillery fire support base. Radio communication with battalion headquarters remained clear, but the distance meant that resupply by helicopter would require additional time and coordination. The captain reported his position and requested a resupply flight for the following morning. He was told that helicopters were committed to other operations, but that a flight would be scheduled as soon as assets became available. The response was routine. Helicopter support in Vietnam was always a matter of priority and availability. The captain acknowledged the message and directed his platoon leaders to begin rationing ammunition. That evening, the company established a defensive perimeter in a slight depression surrounded by thick vegetation. The men dug shallow fighting positions and arranged fields of fire as best they could in the limited visibility. Listening posts were positioned 50 meters out from the perimeter. The night was spent in silence. No fires were allowed. Meals consisted of cold sea rations eaten in darkness. The jungle at night was never truly quiet. Insects buzzed constantly. Branches creaked. Occasionally, something larger moved through the undergrowth at a distance. Soldiers learned to distinguish between the sounds of animals and the sounds of human movement, but the distinction was never absolute. Every sound required attention. At dawn on the third day, the captain attempted to contact battalion headquarters to confirm the resupply flight. Communication was difficult. The radio operator adjusted frequencies and antenna orientation, trying to establish a clear signal. After several attempts, contact was made. The battalion operations officer reported that helicopter assets were still committed to priority operations in another sector. A resupply flight would be scheduled, but no specific time could be confirmed. The captain was advised to continue the mission as planned and to maintain regular communication schedules. He acknowledged the message and assembled his platoon leaders. The situation was discussed without emotion. The company had expended approximately 20% of its ammunition during brief contact the previous afternoon. A small enemy force had been encountered near the trail, and a short firefight had resulted in the enemy withdrawing. Casualties had been light on both sides, but the engagement had consumed ammunition at a rate higher than anticipated. The captain explained that resupply was delayed and that fire discipline would be essential until helicopters could reach them. He directed platoon leaders to enforce strict control over automatic weapons fire. Machine gunners were instructed to fire only on his order or in response to immediate threat. Riflemen were reminded to select targets carefully and to avoid suppressive fire unless absolutely necessary. The patrol continued. The trail was still visible, though it wound through terrain that made movement exhausting. The jungle seemed to grow thicker as the company advanced. Vines hung from trees in dense curtains. Roots created obstacles that had to be climbed over or cut through. Progress was measured in meters per hour rather than kilometers. The men moved with weapons at the ready, eyes scanning the vegetation for movement or irregularity. Every soldier understood that an ambush in this terrain would be devastating. Visibility was so limited that an enemy force could be positioned within a few meters without being detected. By midday, the Point Squad reported finding a recently used campsite. Fires had been extinguished within the last 24 hours. Rice and fish remnants were still present. The area showed signs of occupation by a force larger than a squad, possibly platoon-sized or larger. The captain moved forward to assess the site personally. He examined the layout and the trails leading away from the camp. It was clear that the enemy had departed in an organized manner, likely after detecting the approaching American unit. The question was whether they had withdrawn entirely or whether they were observing from nearby positions. The captain made the decision to halt and establish a perimeter. Pursuing an enemy force of unknown size into unfamiliar jungle without adequate ammunition reserves was tactically unsound. He reported the situation to battalion and requested immediate resupply and guidance. The response came within 30 minutes. Resupply helicopters were still unavailable due to ongoing operations and weather conditions that had developed over the insertion routes. The captain was advised to consolidate his position and prepare for potential contact. Artillery support would be available if needed, but the distance from the fire support base meant that response time would be delayed and accuracy reduced. The company began preparing defensive positions. Soldiers used entrenching tools to dig into the soft jungle floor. Fields of fire were cleared as much as possible without creating obvious signs of occupation. Machine gun positions were sited to cover the most likely avenues of approach. The weapons platoon emplaced the company's 2 M60 machine guns with overlapping sectors of fire. Ammunition was redistributed to ensure that each position had adequate reserves for immediate defense, but the redistribution also made clear how limited those reserves had become. Riflemen now carried an average of 9 magazines each. Machine gunners had less than 400 rounds per gun. Grenade supplies were adequate, but grenades were defensive weapons, useful in close combat, but not sufficient for sustained engagement. The afternoon passed slowly. Heat intensified under the jungle canopy. Soldiers drank water sparingly, aware that resupply would include water as well as ammunition. The listening posts reported no movement. The jungle around the perimeter remained still except for the normal sounds of insects and birds. That stillness was itself a source of concern. Experienced soldiers knew that the jungle often grew quiet before contact. Animals sensed human presence and moved away. Birds stopped calling. The silence that settled over the perimeter as evening approached felt deliberate. Night brought heightened alertness. The company remained at 50% security, with half the men awake and in position at all times. The captain moved among the positions during darkness, checking readiness and morale. He spoke quietly with squad leaders and reminded them of the importance of fire discipline. If contact came during the night, it would likely be in the form of probing attacks designed to provoke a response and reveal positions. The enemy in Vietnam was skilled at exploiting American reliance on firepower. They understood that American units often responded to contact with overwhelming fire, expending ammunition rapidly. In this situation, that response would be catastrophic. The night passed without incident. At first light, the captain again attempted to contact battalion regarding resupply. Weather remained marginal for helicopter operations, but he was told that a flight would be attempted later in the morning. He was instructed to prepare a landing zone and to mark it with smoke when the helicopters approached. The problem was that no suitable landing zone existed within the immediate area. The jungle canopy was unbroken in every direction. Creating a landing zone would require significant time and effort, and the noise would compromise the company's position. The captain explained the situation and was told to identify the nearest natural clearing that could accommodate a helicopter. He assigned a squad to move out and locate such a clearing. The squad returned within 2 hours. They had found a small gap in the canopy approximately 400 meters to the east. The gap was not large, but it might accommodate a single helicopter if the pilot was skilled and willing to accept risk. The captain moved to the location with his radio operator and assessed it personally. The clearing was irregular and surrounded by tall trees. Approach and departure angles were limited. It was not an ideal landing zone, but it was the only option available. He reported the coordinates to battalion and was told that a helicopter would attempt insertion when weather permitted. The company remained in position throughout the morning. Soldiers cleaned weapons and checked equipment. Ammunition was recounted. Defensive positions were improved. The waiting was difficult. Men who had been in combat before understood that waiting under threat was often more exhausting than action. The mind worked constantly, imagining scenarios and calculating risks. Every sound drew attention. Every movement in the vegetation triggered alertness. Hours passed with agonizing slowness. Shortly after noon, the radio operator received a transmission. A resupply helicopter was inbound, estimated time of arrival 20 minutes. The captain ordered the company to prepare for movement to the landing zone. He divided the force, leaving 1 platoon to secure the perimeter and taking 2 platoons to secure the landing zone and receive supplies. Movement to the clearing was conducted with extreme caution. The squad moved in bounds, with security elements positioned forward and on the flanks. The machine gun teams moved with the main body, ready to provide suppressive fire if contact occurred. The clearing was reached without incident. The platoons established security around the perimeter, weapons oriented outward. The captain's radio operator maintained contact with the inbound helicopter, providing updates on wind conditions and obstacles. The sound of rotor blades became audible in the distance, growing louder as the helicopter approached. The captain threw a smoke grenade into the clearing to mark the landing point. Purple smoke drifted upward through the gap in the canopy. The helicopter appeared overhead, a UH-1 Huey moving slowly and carefully. The pilot circled once, assessing the approach. The trees were close on all sides. The margin for error was minimal. The helicopter began its descent, rotor wash creating a violent downdraft that flattened vegetation and threw debris into the air. Soldiers crouched low, holding their helmets and turning away from the rotor blast. The helicopter settled into the clearing with the nose slightly elevated, the pilot maintaining partial power to control the descent. The door gunners scanned the tree line while crew members began pushing out ammunition crates and water containers. Soldiers rushed forward to unload supplies, working quickly to minimize the helicopter's time on the ground. The entire process took less than 3 minutes. As soon as the last crate was offloaded, the pilot increased power and lifted out of the clearing, nose dropping as the aircraft accelerated away through the narrow gap in the canopy. The sound of the rotors faded rapidly, leaving the jungle in sudden silence. The supplies were distributed immediately. Ammunition was allocated to each platoon based on tactical requirements. Riflemen received additional magazines. Machine gunners received belts of linked ammunition. Water containers were divided among the squads. The resupply was adequate but not generous. The company now had sufficient ammunition for defensive operations, but sustained offensive action remained inadvisable. The captain directed that the new supplies be integrated with existing stocks and that fire discipline remain in effect. The movement back to the perimeter was conducted with the same caution as the outbound movement. The noise of the helicopter had announced the company's location to anyone within several kilometers. If enemy forces were in the area, they now knew exactly where the Americans were positioned. The return route was covered by squad bounds with security halts every 50 meters. No contact occurred, but the tension remained high throughout the movement. Upon returning to the perimeter, the captain received new orders from battalion. Intelligence indicated that enemy forces were moving in the area, possibly in response to the company's presence. The captain was directed to maintain position and to report any contact immediately. Artillery support had been coordinated, and fire missions were pre-planned on likely enemy approach routes. The captain acknowledged the orders and directed his platoon leaders to refine defensive preparations. The remainder of the day was spent improving the perimeter. Fighting positions were deepened. Additional camouflage was applied to reduce visibility from ground level. Listening posts were repositioned to provide better early warning. The machine guns were resited to cover gaps in the defensive line. Ammunition was staged for quick access. Grenade pins were straightened to allow for faster deployment. Every possible preparation was made. As darkness fell, the company settled into defensive routine. Half the men remained awake while the other half attempted to rest. Sleep was difficult. The jungle at night was alive with sound, and every sound required interpretation. The rustling of leaves could be wind or movement. The snap of a twig could be an animal or a boot. Soldiers lay in their positions with weapons ready, listening and waiting. At approximately 0200 hours, a listening post reported movement to the north. Multiple individuals were moving through the jungle, attempting to move quietly but creating enough noise to be detected. The captain was alerted immediately. He moved to the position nearest the reported contact and listened. The movement was deliberate and coordinated. This was not an animal. The captain passed word through the perimeter to stand to. Every man moved into position and oriented his weapon toward the likely threat direction. The movement continued for several minutes, then stopped. Silence returned to the jungle. The captain waited, straining to hear any indication of what was happening beyond the perimeter. Minutes passed. The silence was complete. Then, from a different direction, movement was reported by another listening post. The enemy was maneuvering, possibly attempting to locate the perimeter or assess its strength. The captain ordered the listening posts to withdraw to the perimeter. Leaving them exposed risked losing men to an enemy probe. The listening posts withdrew without contact. The perimeter was now fully manned and alert. The captain considered his options. He could call for artillery fire on the suspected enemy positions, but doing so would confirm his location and might provoke an attack. The enemy might simply be passing through the area, unaware of the exact American position. Firing artillery would eliminate that uncertainty. He decided to wait. If the enemy attacked, artillery would be called immediately. Until then, silence and concealment were the best defense. The night continued without further incident. The movement reported earlier did not resume. As dawn approached, the captain allowed half the men to stand down while the other half maintained watch. Exhaustion was becoming a factor. Most of the men had slept poorly for 3 consecutive nights. Fatigue affected judgment and reaction time. The captain knew that the company could not sustain this level of alertness indefinitely. At first light, he contacted battalion and reported the night's events. He requested permission to withdraw to a more defensible position closer to artillery support. The request was denied. Battalion headquarters wanted the company to remain in place to maintain pressure on enemy forces and to gather intelligence on their movements. The captain was assured that additional support would be provided if needed, but for now, the mission remained unchanged. The day was spent in defensive posture. Patrols were sent out in squad strength to investigate the areas where movement had been detected during the night. They found footprints and evidence of recent passage, but no enemy forces were encountered. The tracks indicated a force of at least platoon size, possibly larger. The direction of travel suggested that the enemy was moving parallel to the company's position, possibly repositioning for future operations. By late afternoon, the captain received orders to prepare for extraction. A landing zone would need to be secured, and helicopters would arrive at first light the following morning. The extraction would be conducted in lifts, with one platoon extracted at a time. The captain began planning the withdrawal. The movement to the landing zone would be the most vulnerable phase of the operation. The company would be strung out along a route, difficult to defend and exposed to ambush. The movement would need to be carefully coordinated and covered by fire support, if possible. That evening, artillery concentrations were fired on suspected enemy positions and likely ambush sites along the withdrawal route. The fire missions were conducted without observation, relying on map coordinates and estimated positions. The artillery impacted in the jungle with distant crumps that echoed through the trees. Whether the fire had any effect on enemy forces was unknown, but it served to complicate their planning and possibly discourage movement. The night was quiet. No movement was detected. The men rested as best they could, knowing that the following day would be demanding. At 0400 hours, the company began movement toward the extraction landing zone. The route was the same one used for the resupply operation days earlier. The movement was slow and deliberate. Security halts were frequent. The machine guns were positioned to cover the rear of the column, ready to provide suppressive fire if the company was pursued. The landing zone was reached without contact. The platoons established security while the captain coordinated with the extraction helicopters. The first lift arrived shortly after sunrise. 6 helicopters approached in formation, descending into the clearing in pairs. The first platoon loaded quickly and lifted off. The helicopters climbed away through the gap in the canopy and turned east toward Cu Chi. The second lift arrived 20 minutes later and extracted the second platoon. The captain remained on the ground with the final platoon, maintaining security until the last possible moment. The final lift arrived as scheduled. The remaining platoon loaded under the cover of the machine guns, which were the last weapons to be pulled back. The captain boarded the last helicopter as the door gunners scanned the tree line. The aircraft lifted off and accelerated, away from the clearing. As the helicopter climbed, the jungle below became visible as an unbroken green expanse. The clearing disappeared beneath the canopy, and the landing zone vanished as if it had never existed. The flight to Cu Chi took less than 30 minutes. The helicopters landed at the base camp, and the company unloaded onto the tarmac. Weapons were cleared and secured. Ammunition was turned into the supply point for inventory. The men moved to their assigned areas for debriefing and rest. The operation was concluded. In the days that followed, intelligence reports indicated that enemy forces had indeed been active in the area during the company's patrol. Documents captured in subsequent operations suggested that the North Vietnamese unit had been aware of the American presence and had considered attacking, but had ultimately decided that the risk was unacceptable. The reasons for that decision were not entirely clear, but one factor mentioned in the captured documents was uncertainty about American strength and support. The enemy commander had apparently been concerned about artillery and air support and had chosen to avoid engagement. The company's experience was not unusual for operations in Vietnam. Supply lines were long and often unreliable. Helicopter support was finite and subject to competing demands. Infantry units frequently operated with limited ammunition reserves, relying on discipline and training rather than firepower superiority. The jungle terrain favored defense and concealment, making every patrol a calculated risk. Commanders had to balance mission requirements against logistical reality, making decisions based on incomplete information and uncertain support. Fire discipline became a defining characteristic of effective units in Vietnam. Soldiers learned to choose targets carefully and to avoid wasting ammunition on uncertain threats. Automatic weapons were employed selectively rather than continuously. Grenades were reserved for situations where they would have maximum effect. This restraint was not natural for American forces, who were accustomed to overwhelming firepower and generous supply. It required training, leadership, and experience to develop and maintain. The patrol west of Cu Chi in the spring of 1968 illustrated the realities of sustained operations in the Vietnamese jungle. A company of infantry, separated from reliable resupply and faced with potential enemy contact, survived through disciplined use of resources and careful tactical decision-making. The ammunition shortage, while serious, did not result in disaster because leaders and soldiers understood the importance of fire control and conservation. The jungle, which provided concealment for both sides, became an environment where patience and discipline mattered as much as firepower. The lessons learned from operations like this one shaped American tactics throughout the war. Units operating in remote areas developed procedures for rationing supplies and for coordinating resupply under difficult conditions. Leaders learned to assess risk differently, understanding that aggressive pursuit of the enemy was not always possible or advisable. Soldiers learned to function in an environment where support was uncertain and where survival often depended on restraint rather than action. The men who served in these conditions understood that war in Vietnam was different from the conflicts their predecessors had fought. The jungle imposed limitations that could not be overcome by technology or firepower alone. Ammunition, water, and time all became finite resources that had to be managed carefully. The experience of being low on ammunition, surrounded by jungle, and uncertain of resupply became a common thread in the stories told by veterans of that war. It was a reality that shaped how they fought and how they survived.